It was supposed to be a perfect day. The sun was shining, birds chirping in the distance, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and wildflowers. My wife, Emily, our 2 kids, Liam and Sophie, and I had planned this family picnic for weeks. We picked a spot deep in the woods, a secluded clearing by a quiet river that seemed straight out of a postcard. We packed everything: blankets, sandwiches, fruit, and even the old Polaroid camera Emily loved so much. The kids were buzzing with excitement, and as we hiked through the woods, their laughter echoed among the trees. It was a sound that filled me with contentment, a rare moment of peace in our usually hectic lives. When we arrived at the clearing, it was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The grass was a vibrant green, the river gently flowing, and not another soul in sight. We spread out the blanket, and as Emily started unpacking the food, I took a deep breath, feeling the stress of the week melt away. We ate, played games, and snapped pictures, capturing the joy on Liam and Sophie's faces. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the clearing, I decided to take a short walk along the river while Emily rested and the kids played nearby. The riverbank was peaceful, the gentle flow of water soothing. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. The trees on the opposite bank seemed different. Their trunks twisted in unnatural ways, their branches curling towards the sky like clawed hands. I shook my head, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but the unease settled in my gut. When I returned to the clearing, I froze. The scene before me was exactly the same as when I left, down to the last detail. Emily was still unpacking the food, Liam and Sophie were playing the same game, and the sun hadn't moved an inch in the sky. It was as if time had stood still. "Hey, didn't you guys do anything while I was gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Emily looked up, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean? You've only been gone a minute," she said, her tone playful but tinged with uncertainty. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I laughed it off, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. As the day wore on, the feeling of unease grew. No matter what we did, it felt like we were trapped in a loop. The sun stayed in the same spot, casting the same shadows, and every time I looked at my watch, only a few minutes had passed. The kids didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in their games, but Emily did. She tried to hide it, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I suggested we pack up and leave, but when we tried to retrace our steps, the path we had taken was gone. The woods had changed, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. No matter which direction we turned, we ended up back at the clearing. Panic set in. Liam and Sophie started crying, and Emily's hands trembled as she clutched my arm. We were trapped, and I had no idea how to get us out. As night fell, the clearing was swallowed by darkness, the only light coming from the full moon that seemed unnaturally large. The once soothing sounds of nature had turned sinister. The rustling leaves sounded like whispers, and the distant hoot of an owl sent chills down my spine. We huddled together on the blanket, too afraid to move. The woods around us seemed to come alive, the trees swaying even though there was no wind. I kept my eyes on the river, but it too had changed. The water was still, almost black, and I could swear I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Liam clung to Emily, his face pale with fear, while Sophie buried her head in my chest. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. Then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, hovering just above the ground at the edge of the clearing. They were too large, too bright, and they were watching us. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare as the eyes slowly advanced, inching closer with every heartbeat. Emily screamed, snapping me out of my trance. I grabbed the kids and ran, dragging them toward the river, but the water had risen, flooding the banks and cutting off our escape. We were trapped. The eyes were right behind us now, and I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned to face whatever was stalking us, ready to fight, but there was nothing there. The eyes had vanished, but the oppressive presence remained, suffocating us with fear. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. We tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually overtook us. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I woke to the feeling of cold, damp earth beneath me. The clearing was gone. We were now in the middle of a dense forest. The trees around us gnarled and twisted like the ones I'd seen on the opposite bank of the river. The air was thick with fog, and the ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Emily was still asleep, her face pale and drawn, and the kids were huddled together, their breaths shallow. I shook her awake, panic rising in my chest. "We need to go now," I whispered urgently, trying to keep my voice steady for the kids' sake. Emily's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around in confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to keep moving." We gathered our things quickly, and I led the way through the forest, trying to find any sign of the path we had taken to get here. But the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the sky. The fog grew thicker with every step, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. We wandered aimlessly, the forest seeming to twist and change around us, leading us in circles. The trees whispered our names, their voices soft and mocking, and I could feel their eyes on us, watching, waiting. Sophie was the first to break. She stopped in the middle of the path, tears streaming down her face. "I want to go home," she cried, her voice echoing through the forest. "We're trying, sweetie," Emily said, her voice choked with emotion as she knelt to comfort her. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that we might never leave this place. Liam, usually the bravest of the two, clung to my leg, his small hands trembling. "Daddy, are we going to die here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but the words caught in my throat. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty furniture, cobwebs in the corners, and a cold, damp smell that clung to everything. But it was a refuge, and for a moment we felt safe. I found an old oil lamp on a table and managed to light it, casting a dim, flickering light around the room. Emily and the kids huddled together on a moth-eaten couch while I searched the cabin for anything useful. There was a small fireplace, and I managed to start a fire, the warmth a small comfort in the oppressive cold of the forest. As the fire crackled, we finally had a moment to catch our breath. The kids were exhausted, their eyes heavy with sleep, and Emily rested her head on my shoulder, her body trembling. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice filled with despair. I didn't have an answer. The forest was alive, and it had us in its grip. But I knew we couldn't stay in the cabin forever. We had to find a way out before the forest claimed us. That night, as the fire burned low, I heard it again. The low growl that had followed us through the woods. It was closer now, just outside the cabin, and I could hear the sound of something scratching at the walls, as if testing the strength of the old wood. Emily stirred beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay quiet," I mouthed, reaching for a heavy piece of wood from the fireplace. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then we heard the door creak as if something was pressing against it. The kids woke, their eyes wide with terror, and I motioned for them to stay behind me. The door shook, the wood groaning under the pressure, and then, with a loud crack, it burst open. But there was nothing there, just the dark, foggy forest beyond. The fire flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and I could feel the presence of something just outside the threshold, waiting. Emily grabbed the kids, pulling them close as I slowly approached the open door, the piece of wood raised in my hand. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air, and looked around, expecting to see those glowing eyes watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just silence. And then, the whispers started again, louder this time, as if the forest itself was speaking directly to me. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." I staggered back, the voices echoing in my mind, and slammed the door shut, barring it with whatever I could find. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, and I could feel the walls closing in around us. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking with fear. "But where will we go?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with terror. "Anywhere but here," I replied, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We have to keep moving." We packed up what little we had and prepared to leave the cabin. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was cold and dark. As I opened the door, the fog outside seemed even thicker, swirling around us like a living thing. We stepped out into the night, the whispers of the forest following us. I kept the kids close, one hand holding Emily's, the other gripping the piece of wood like a lifeline. We walked for what felt like hours, the forest twisting and changing around us. The path was gone, and the trees seemed to move of their own accord, blocking our way, forcing us to turn back and start again. The fog was so thick it was hard to breathe, and the cold seeped into our bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of something following us, always just out of sight. The glowing eyes appeared again, flickering in the darkness, watching, waiting. Finally, we stumbled upon a clearing, similar to the one where our nightmare had begun. But this one was different. The trees around it were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that crunched underfoot. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, out of place in the middle of the forest, and yet somehow I knew it was the key to our escape. The whispers grew louder as we approached the altar, a chorus of voices urging us to stop, to turn back. But I ignored them, driven by a desperate need to protect my family. We gathered around the altar, and I placed my hand on the cold stone, hoping for some kind of answer, some way to break free of the forest's grip. But as soon as I touched it, a searing pain shot through my arm, and I pulled back, gasping in pain. The stone began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, rising from the earth itself. "You cannot leave," the voices thundered, and the altar cracked, splitting in two. From the ground, a dark, shadowy figure emerged, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It had no eyes, but I could feel it watching us, its presence suffocating, its malice palpable. The kids screamed, and Emily clung to me, her eyes wide with terror. The figure loomed over us, its shadow stretching across the clearing, and I knew we were out of time. But then, in the chaos, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light in the distance, just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a beacon in the darkness. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing the kids and pulling Emily along. "Head for the light!" We ran as fast as we could, the figure close behind us, the ground shaking with every step. The light grew brighter, and I could see an opening in the trees, a way out. The whispers grew frantic, pleading with us to stop, to stay, but we kept running, driven by a primal need to survive. The light enveloped us, and I could feel the warmth of the sun on my skin, the smell of fresh air filling my lungs. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We stumbled out of the forest and onto the road where our car was parked. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The forest behind us was silent, the twisted trees gone, replaced by the familiar woods we had entered that morning. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. We never spoke of that day again. We moved away, far from those woods, and tried to forget what had happened. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still see those glowing eyes watching me, hear the whispers calling my name. The forest let us go, but I know it's still out there, waiting for the next family to wander too far, to stray into its domain. And when they do, it won't let them go so easily.